Hello, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, or evening, depending on where in the globe you're logging in from. Welcome to the third annual Tasveer South Asian Lit Fest. My name is Ishita Saran, and I am one of the TSAL coordinators. Tasveer is a Seattle based arts organization whose social justice driven mission is to amplify South Asian voices through film, literature, and storytelling. The Tasveer Festival, Watch, Read, Talk will showcase the best in South Asian film through the 16th Tasveer South Asian Film Festival, the best in literature through the 3rd Tasveer South Asian Lit Fest, and the best in storytelling. Through this festival, Tasveer amplifies underrepresented South Asian voices, places a spotlight on South Asian artists, and creates a safe space for dialogues within our communities. I would like to extend my thanks to Rita Meher, the co-founder and ED of Tasveer, Alka Kurian, the director of TSAL, and the entire TSAL team who have worked tirelessly to put this festival together. I would also like to thank all the authors who have agreed to participate and increase the viewership of this festival. And now it is with great pleasure I welcome you to today's panel discussion, Setting and Mood. In the literary world, place and atmosphere are as important as character and plot. Join our panel of authors, Kiran Bhat, Sunil Shinde, Jenny Bhat, Anjali Enjeti, and Shivani Sibal as they share details on how they create the perfect setting and mood to bring their narratives alive. We also have with us today the award-winning author and journalist, Veena Rao, who is leading this discussion as a moderator. Her recently released novel, Purple Lotus, is a Georgia Author of the Year 2021 finalist and the winner of the She Writes Press Step Scholarship. She is the founder, publisher, and editor-in-chief of NRI Pulse, an Atlanta-based news publication. She has been recognized by the Limca Book of Records, which is the Indian version of the Guinness Book of Records, as the first Indian woman to edit and publish a newspaper outside India. I would like to hand the stage to Veena Rao now to take this discussion forward. So over to you, Veena. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ishida. Hello and welcome to our discussion on the topic setting and mood. A great setting can offer so much more than just a place where the characters exist and interact with each other. Authors use setting to add to the mood, the atmosphere, to create a sense of place. Their words make us happy or sad. They make us angry or upset, or they could even give us goosebumps. Let's meet our panel of 5 wonderful authors who will talk about how they create the perfect setting to evoke a certain mood, to bring their narratives alive. Anjali Enjeti is a former attorney and award-winning journalist based near Atlanta. She is the author of Southbound, Essays on Identity, Inheritance, and Social Change, and the debut novel, The Parted Earth. She is the co-founder of the Georgia chapter of Desi Blue, an organization for South Asian Democrats, and teaches in the MFA program at Reinhardt University. Welcome, Anjali. Jenny Bhatt is a writer, literary translator, and book critic. She is the host of the Desi Books podcast and teaches at Writing Workshops, Dallas. Her collection, Each of Us Killers Stories, won a 2020 Four-Word Indies Award in the short stories category and was a finalist in the multicultural adult fiction category. Her literary translation, Ratno Dholi, has been shortlisted for the 2021 PFC Wow Book Awards for English translation. Welcome, Jenny. Having worked her way around India, England, Germany, Scotland, and various parts of the US, she now lives in Dallas, Texas. That's Jenny. Kiran Bhatt is a global citizen formed in the suburb of India, Georgia, to parents from southern Karnataka in India. He has currently traveled to over 330 countries, lived in 18 different places, and speaks 12 languages. Wow, Kiran. He is primarily known as the author of We of the Forsaken World, but he has authored books in 4 foreign languages. Kiran is joining us from London. Sunil Shinde has been an ardent urban sketcher since 2013 and is a correspondent for the urban sketches blog, urbansketches.org. Over the last 20 years, Sunil has traveled to over 30 countries, tracing stories of history, religion, and culture. When he isn't traveling, he's dreaming of traveling. He's also building an AI-based population health product in stealth mode. He lives in a cottage in the woods in Redmond, Washington, with his wife, 2 daughters, and their golden retriever, Oscar. Welcome, Sunil. Shivani Sibal was born and brought up in New Delhi, where she continues to live with her husband and daughters. Equations is her first novel. So welcome, panelists. And we'd love for all viewers to get involved in the session and make it as interactive as possible. So please do feel free to post questions for the panelists in the chat window. We'll take questions from the audience at the end of the session. But before we get there, here's a fun exercise. Our panelists will be reading a passage from the beautiful books through the first half of the session. And since the topic of the discussion is setting and mood, I'd like to invite you all to write in the comments what picture or mood or feeling the reading evoked in you. What's the first image that popped into your head, or how did it affect you? What's the mood the author is trying to convey? Later in the session, I'll read out your comments and have the panelists respond to them. So let's get started. And my first question to the panelists is, all your books begin with a vivid setting, right? Can you describe your process of getting into your story? How did you decide that this is where your story would begin? And how did you go about creating a setting for it? We'll let Kiran go first.
Thank you so much, Veena, for having me. And I want to thank all the people who have worked very hard to organize this wondrous session for Tasveer. Before I answer the question, I'd like to give a little bit of my background. I'm an Indian American. I was born and raised in Georgia, but to people from Karnataka. And someone who ontologically, kind of existentially, was born in between cultures, has a little bit of a different way of understanding setting and environment and place. And so I think a lot of my projects, and then I started to travel, I started to live a life of wandering, I started to live a life in which I would be like in one place or another in very short amounts of time. So as a result, my ideas of the globe, the topography, the way that we understand life itself became different. And so I wanted to start to project or to create a sense of that atmosphere in literature, what it means to be someone who is not connected to just one place or one territory, one topography, but who tries to posit their understanding of a literature from a global perspective, from a place where all the places are kind of speaking at once. My novel, We of the Forsaken World, was one of the first books that I designed to start to look at the world from that perspective. And it came from when I was traveling in Eastern Europe, and I just started to posit about the sorts of worlds that I thought were being forsaken in the greater narrative of the earth, the types of narratives we put in the world. You know, I started to imagine places that, for example, you know, the slums where the extreme poor live next to the hyper rich, or, you know, little villages where just the smallest little trips in moral standing can cause great repercussions, or towns and cities are destroyed by industrial spills, or the tribal people who are being destroyed by logging industrialization. I wanted to put these types of 4 humanities into a work of literature, and I want to put them in a space that was a globalized space, you know, a representation of our kind of global digital realities. And so this book is 16 vignettes, 16 people who are blurred and interconnected through these sorts of like lines of poetry, these little snippets that are like little intersections of their mind, or little intersections of their ways of thinking, blurring and interconnecting into each other, creating kind of a line of 16 people blurring and interconnecting at once across these 4 various landscapes. In order to compose this, I believe that I had to just look at the world and just put myself on a territory. I just had to say, this is my world, this is my land, this is kind of an alternate dimension of our understanding of topography that I, as a person who has a more like probably bicultural or third culture understanding of the world, would posit. And so from that space, I started to create my work and my art.
Right. And your book begins with a gas leak from a pesticide plant that kills 2,400 people, which reminded me of the Bhopal gas tragedy.
I was inspired by Bhopal, actually. That was the place that kind of Bhopal and also Chernobyl.
So did you actually visit the place?
Not yet, no. I did not visit Bhopal, but I have actually been to other places, but I did a lot of research, but we'll get to that a little later. But
right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anjali, the opening chapter of The Parted Earth is set in a school in pre-partition India, and your protagonist Deepa is writing an essay on Tagore's Gitanjali. Tell us, take us to the story behind the story. How did you decide that this is where your story would begin?
So it was very important for me to tell this story of partition, which is something we all have read and know something about, from the perspective of a young girl. The protagonist, Deepa, is 16 years old. She is right on the cusp of womanhood, right? She is at that point where she realizes that her views of the world might not perfectly align with those of her parents, right? Internally, she is sort of challenging, how her parents are viewing what they are living through, right? The novel opens in early summer, the summer of partition. So she's sort of seeing the collapse of the political structure around her and the struggle for the birthing of these two new nations. But at the same time, she is still a schoolgirl sitting in the classroom. Her priorities are her friends, her family, the activities she enjoys, which she loves working at and going after school to her parents' clinic. But her view of what happens through the rest of her life is very much based in literature. We find out later that Deepa becomes a poet. She becomes, in fact, a professor at a university. And it's the poetry that she comes to write, which of course she's inspired by Tagore and others. But the poetry she comes to write very much reflects the settings of her life over the next 70 years, which certainly start in New Delhi in 1947, but then evolve later on to the UK and eventually the Netherlands. So that glimpse at the beginning of her fascination with literature, of her love of storytelling and poetry, sort of sets her off on that track to finding and understanding how words will eventually help her heal.
And that's a powerful opening.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Anjali. And Jenny, your collection of short stories begins with a story titled Return to India, which I loved, which is based on the 2017 shooting of tech executive Srinivas Kuchibotla in Kansas. So yours is a collection of short stories. Why did you decide to choose to put this story at the beginning of the collection?
Yeah, I mean, arranging short story collections, I think personally, is an art in itself, because how you choose to show the progression of stories is a story, it tells the story in itself, right? That wasn't the opening story initially when I had the collection out, but what we found is that there were two stories in the collection. One was based on racially motivated violence, which is Return to India, and the other one was based on caste-based violence, which is set in India. And that's the title story, Each of Us Killers. And so my publisher and editor thought that would be a good way to bookend. I mean, the whole collection is set in the workplace. Every story is about people in the workplace, in their particular workplace, dealing with some conflict or other. It's some conflict related to work. And these two stories, one race-based violence and the other caste-based violence, which both happen related to work, we thought if we bookended the collection with these two, and then we arranged the stories in between, that was the progression. So that was the thought behind starting with that. But that particular story doesn't actually start with a setting, because, you know, I say this, I teach creative writing at Writing Workshop Dallas, and my preference, I don't think of, oh, I'm going to start a story with setting. When I start a story, for me, it's usually have the character say or do something that takes them to the point of no return. They can't take it back. And for me as a writer, that's when it starts to get interesting, because I want to see myself, how is this person going to get out of their mess? And so I usually start with something that the character has said or done that they can't take back. Eventually it does end up, maybe, not all my stories have an opening that has a vivid setting. It starts with a dialogue or an action, but eventually, of course, setting is a part of it. And I think as the others have said, setting isn't just geography. Setting is also the historical period, the time, you know, how do you evoke mood? There's all kinds of other things that have to come into play to evoke mood. And so it may not be initially, when you think of setting, at least with my stories in this collection, you're not necessarily going to get a laundry list of descriptive things about what's going on in the physical surroundings, but I am going to get into some of these other aspects that also create an atmosphere. And one last thing I'll say, and I'll stop, is I also say this to my students, I think of setting in two ways. One is where the setting is a frame for the character or the scene, and two is where the setting is in itself a character in the story. And I know there's a question later about favorite writers and examples. I'll illustrate both of those, but I always think of setting in two ways. One is where it's actually a frame, a necessary frame. It's framing what's happening, framing the plot, you know, and integral to the plot. Because I think it has to be integral. That story, if you took it out of that setting and put it somewhere else, it shouldn't work. That the setting should be so relevant and so important to the plot that if you took that story out, and if I returned to India and set it somewhere other than the American Midwest, it shouldn't work the way it has worked here. So anyway, that's how I feel.
Wonderful. And it's interesting that you should say that setting is also about, the setting is also a character.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Yes, interesting. Thank you, Jenny. Shivani, you're a lifelong resident of Delhi, and like Jenny said, Delhi is a lead character of your book. The book opens with a sign of the Sikand family getting ready to leave his ancestral home, where several generations of his family has lived. Why this? And your story moves back and forth in time. So how did you decide that this is this would be the most impactful opening for your book?
I think that so many people ask all of us writers, what is your book about? And to me, that is a terrifying question, because I just don't know what to say. There's no straight answer for these things, right? So, I thought about it, and I would say my book is at its essence a book about class, right? And class is something which has so much nuance in it. And actually setting and mood is a very effective tool to portray that, right? Sikand house, the childhood home of both my protagonists, one of whom is the son of the master of the house, and one who's the son of his father's driver. Sikand house had to be where my story began. So I always knew it had to begin with Sikand house and its loss, because the loss of a house, and as many people have discussed, the partition is a very evocative thing in India. To lose your family home is something which is immediately relatable, and a fear a lot of people do have. So I always knew it had to begin there. But I'm a debut writer, so maybe obviously people do have a lot more experience than me, and I will evolve and change as everyone should. But I began my story with two goalposts, a beginning and an end, right? And somewhere along the line, you weave it. So I don't know how many people write intuitively and how many write practically, where they know where it's going to begin, where it's going to end. Unfortunately, I just get down to it and it just takes its own life.
Yeah, I was like you, Shivani. I had no clue what I was going to write about. And it took me, it was the first draft was bloated and messy. But I taught myself to write as the story progressed. So I hear you.
Next time.
So Sunil, the prologue from Cairo to Beirut is set in Petra, Jordan, where you're on a spring break with your daughter and you're sketching the facade of some famous monument, and something inspires you to take up this crazy wild adventure. Can you talk about it?
Thank you, Veena. I guess my book begins where the book actually began. I was in Petra. I'm sketching the Kazne, which is the rock cut monument, which is very famous. And as I was sketching, there is this Bedouin who is selling prints who approaches me and, in a bid to get my attention, points out that I'm sketching something that he's selling, right? He's selling a print that is made by a Scottish artist who had traveled this route, right, 200 years ago. And, it's actually he who made that connection. And I made a snap decision right there, right, which is to try and follow the artist's journey, right? And I knew about the journey, but that snap decision was made right there, which is going back to what Jenny was saying, right? That was the point of no return for me, within a matter of seconds. And which is kind of like me, right? Right in the middle of an adventure, here I am planning the next adventure, right? And it's almost a leitmotif in my life. And in that sense, for me, as it happens, right? Every situation I have in the book is a massive setting. I have described what happens. Invariably, these situations are at crossroads of culture and history. And I think you said it correctly a few moments ago. These settings are my characters. I don't have characters, right? Mine is a nonfiction in that sense.
Right. Yes. Thank you, Sunil. And Kiran, your stories represent. I think we started off with Kiran, right? Okay, so at this point, I'd like to invite Anjali to read a passage from her beautiful book, The Parted Earth.
Thank you so much, Veena. I appreciate it. So my novel, The Parted Earth, came out in May from Hub City Press. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a book that begins in the 1947 partition in New Delhi, but then proceeds through the next 70 years on multiple continents and countries. It's primarily told through two characters' points of view. Deepa, who is 16 and living in Delhi during the partition, and her estranged granddaughter named Sean, who is living in Atlanta in the present day. Sean is 41 years old when her part of the novel opens. She's just had a miscarriage. She is in the midst of a marriage that is completely deteriorating and looking toward divorce. But also Sean, as a biracial woman, she is half Indian and half white. She has never really had a connection with her Indian heritage. She was raised by her single white mother, and her Indian father, when she was 5 years old, sort of abandoned the family to move to India, and then ended up passing away when Sean was 11. So I'm going to read a scene that takes place in Atlanta when Sean has recently miscarried. She's realizing that she needs to begin a new life. And her dear friend and neighbor, a woman named Chandani, takes her to the Atlanta Botanical Gardens to sort of help Sean and encourage Sean to begin the healing process. Their intended destination was just around the bend. Earth Goddess, a woman the height of a 2-story home, her shoulders, left arm, and face above ground, as if only the top part of her had sprouted from the earth. Her skin was a palette of lush green leaves, Thick plaits of hair in green and purple, vines flowed down her back. She sat just behind a pool of water, eyes closed, face serene, her hand opened, palm up. Water cascaded from it. I don't believe there's any such thing as moving on, Chandani said. I think we simply rotate through cycles of joy and grief, like riding a carousel. Sometimes we are up, sometimes we are down. But we are always circling back, never getting too far from where we started, from the source of our pain. Chandani had a point. Sean's father died. After Sean's father died, she found a way for a few years to compartmentalize her sadness, but it erupted when she was a teenager. The summer she was 15, she and her mother had forgotten to celebrate his birthday for the first time since his death. It was the only day of the year her mother ever talked about her father. When Sean realized his birthday had passed, the first words that tumbled out of her mouth were not about his birthday. They were about her mother's decision not to move to India with him. If we had joined him in India, she shouted, we might have still been a family. We could have pressured him to go to the hospital sooner. The doctors could have discovered his aneurysm before it was too late. Sean hadn't realized until that summer how much she blamed her mother for her father's death. Sean took a deep breath, exhaled. A breeze kicked up, brushed through the petals framing the pond. She took it all in, the gentle sounds of trickling water, chirping birds, the rustling of leaves. The earth goddess's outstretched hand was an offering, a blessing, an absolution, perhaps, that Sean hadn't realized she needed. A couple pushing a stroller walked by. The baby had black hair, fists pumping in the air. Thinking about babies the past several days had been so painful for her. The smile this infant brought to her face surprised her. Chandani glanced at the stroller and then looked at Sean. Have you thought about naming your baby? He was your son. He will always be your son. A name might give you a little bit of closure. The thought had never occurred to Sean to name a baby she'd been pregnant with for barely 3 months, but naming her baby would mark his place in their family history. Just think about it, Chandani said, before Sean could answer. She then rose and offered Sean her arm. Sean looped hers through it. They turned and walked slowly away from the earth goddess toward another part of the gardens. As they did, a ray of light escaped between clouds and shined upon their faces. Thank you.
That was beautiful and touching. Thank you, Anjali. So what stands out in my mind about the Parted Earth are the scenes set at the Taj Mahal, where the past and the present sort of converge, because it's an important location in both Deepa's and Shan's stories. So my question to you, Anjali, as well as to the other panelists is, does setting influence the conflicts your characters face? Does it come into play in the development of their character arcs? Does it carry the plot forward? Anjali?
Absolutely. So I'll start with the reference you just made to the scenes at the Taj Mahal. So, the novel is really about a family that has completely ruptured. They are not at all emotionally, psychologically, or geographically connected with one another. The first scene at the Taj Mahal is one where Sean is 10 years old and has been dragged to India for the first time to see this father, who she's hardly seen since she was in kindergarten. And I wanted to set it at the Taj Mahal because the Taj Mahal is symbolic, obviously, in many ways, but particularly about its sort of, its eternal love, right? Here we have a couple who was so in love and never wanted to be apart from one another. Well, that is a complete foil to Sean's family, right? I mean, every relationship in Sean's family is broken. Not only did her parents separate when she was very young, but Sean's father left her and passed away. Sean is estranged from her grandmother. So I sort of wanted to show this contrast between the reality of this place of everlasting love and Sean's situation. Partition obviously is a very sort of socio-political conflict, right? And certainly that was important for the novel. And it's the first section of the novel that's set in partition. But the really sort of big conflict that I was looking at is the conflict of living with trauma, and how trauma seems to sort of infuse itself for decades, through the generations that follow. So, for example, you know, the scene at the gardens that I read, you know, that became a scene that was really the turning point for Sean, sort of dealing with all of these conflicts that she had, right? The sort of inability to be connected with her ancestral history, you know, the inability to really feel close to her Indian heritage. This family, I mean, she came from a family that collapsed, and she's now, the family she tried to build with her husband, Max, has now also failed. So these are the conflicts that are really in the forefront of her life. And so when I looked at the 70 years that begin in 1947, it was crucial for me to find settings that I could marry with the conflicts that the main characters were experiencing. And so, for example, there's a setting, a couple settings in 1950s in London. We're in Amsterdam in the present day. We're in Lahore in the present day. And I really wanted to use the setting, as Jenny says, as a character, so that the setting is always in a conversation with the protagonist in the book, right? It cannot be removed. The reason I chose the scene to read that I did is because there is quite literally a third character in the scene, which is the Earth Goddess, which is an actual botanical sculpture in Atlanta. It's fantastic if you've ever had a chance to go. And she is essentially serving in the scene as a listener, as an active listener to this character who is sort of at this turning point in her life, where her world has collapsed in an analogous way to the way her grandmother's world had collapsed 70 years later, and is trying to pick herself off the ground. She's trying to begin a new life, but she's also trying to find a new life. And so even though there's a lot of internal conflict going on within Sean, I was very intentional about setting the scene in a place of peace, in a place that might represent the beginning of a journey for her to heal, for her to perhaps repair, if possible, some of these very broken relationships, and to sort of give her the confidence at the age of 41 to really find herself again, and to get to know herself, and to find a way to heal from her own traumas that really was healthy and centered on her needs. And so throughout the book, I tried very hard to pick these sort of settings, whether it's the Taj Mahal, whether it's the steps of a university in London, to highlight sort of how the characters are dealing with the conflicts. And most of these conflicts, with the exception of the scenes in Partition, really are sort of very internalized conflicts that they're grappling with.
Right. And I love that the setting of peace is set in Atlanta.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Anjali. Sunil, you are obviously the principal character of your illustrated memoir. Can you talk about the conflicts you faced during your journey from Cairo to Beirut?
So most of the conflicts were the settings. If you think about it, I was moving in an area which is known to be, to be full of conflicts. At every juncture, at every step, right, I was in the middle of settings where history and culture has collided. The landscapes are massive, almost, biblical scale, right? Massive deserts, monuments that have been built during the classical Islamic phase. Monasteries, the longest living monasteries in Sinai, where Moses is said to have communed with God himself. Crusader castles, battlefields where Alexander changed history and geography. Roman ruins within 10 miles of Syria that were built to the scale of giants, right? So these are tremendous settings that I'm moving through all the time, the 3 months that I was traveling. I remember this one time in Jerusalem. I was walking this narrow street. The cobblestones of this street are still fresh from the recent renovation 600 years ago. On one side, on the left, is the Muslim quarter. The Christian quarter is on the right, and then you turn, and now you have the Jewish quarter on the right. So right at that corner, right, and I remember saying this to myself, oh my God, I am in the epicenter of the epicenter, right? I'm right in the heart of the conflict. All along for me, it was a matter of keeping myself open to what was happening in the present, right? I did not need to create any conflict. The conflict was creating my book in that sense, right? And in this case, I was sketching all the time, right? A bunch of copious notes. The book, I think the book pretty much wrote itself.
Right. I hope you also took some photos, did you?
I do have some pictures, but it's largely I came back with several full sketchbooks that I painted from.
Wonderful. Shivani, much of your story takes place in the Sikand house. Tell us about the setting for this ancestral home and how it influences the two main protagonists, Ahan and Rajesh, and how it influences what they become.
I think that, because many of you may have not read my book, I just wanted to give a small introduction, it is the two protagonists, Rajesh and Ahan, are son of the master of the house and the master's driver, and they're the same age and they grew up together. However, the master's son lives in the main house, and his friend, the same age, who's the son of the driver, lives in the staff quarter. So in that, there is the stark contrast between a 1940s Delhi bungalow and this very, very tiny staff quarters that are there. Sikand house itself is a metaphor for India and for the old elite giving way to the new. So that is where the idea of using the mood of the house right at the beginning came from too. But, I actually believe, contrary to maybe what some others would say, I think setting and mood do have limits in that they are, the plot is in the driving seat and the plot influences the plot. The plot drives the plot. You can't substitute it with a setting and a mood. The story must tell itself and the setting must enhance it or accompany it or whatever, but it can't be the main thing. What do you think, Veena?
I agree, absolutely. I think they all go hand in hand, plot, setting, mood, all of it. But of course, plot is what drives the setting, right? I mean, yes. You create your setting around your plot.
Yes, absolutely. So, are all of us, prisoners of our circumstance? And in that way, is a plot, is a setting interchangeable? Probably not. I mean, as an Indian living in India, I couldn't interchange my life with any of yours or in the reverse. But stories are universal, aren't they?
They are, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Shivani. Jenny, your stories move from the Midwest to the UK, to Mumbai, to rural Gujarat. Give us a glimpse of your diverse settings and how they influence your characters.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, as I said earlier, the collection is, the main theme of the collection is conflicts in the workplace. So every story is set in the protagonist's workplace, whether that happens to be a housemaid at a house in Ahmedabad or a farmer in a rural village in Gujarat, or a techie engineer at an American Midwestern engineering firm. Now, confession, I have lived and worked in all of these places. So pretty much almost all the settings in the book are places that I have lived and worked in, because although my working career took me to Silicon Valley, my roots are very much in rural Gujarat. We still have ancestral homes there. My parents came from rural Gujarat. Their parents, they lived there, they grew up there. We still go back there. And so for me, almost the last decade or so, when I had moved back to India to live there, that's where I was moving around and working in doing my work. So I would say that pretty much all my settings are places that I've lived in. I didn't plan it that way, but it just so happened that I was interested in writing about people from those places. And Shivani is right in that, I never started out with, I'm going to set my plot is what drove the setting, right? When I decided I'm interested in a character whose job is X and who has to deal with this situation or conflict Y. And therefore, what is the best frame for X and Y, character X and situation Y? What is the best frame for that? And so that's really where my settings originate from. Now, in some cases, as I mentioned earlier, again, the setting is very much the frame. The story cannot be moved. I couldn't take the story that was set in Ahmedabad, in urban Ahmedabad, and move it to rural Gujarat. It just wouldn't work, even though it's the same state. It was important to frame for that. So that's very
Those settings.
somebody's talking.
Be a part of it.
I think it's Ishita.
Does it come
Can
easier?
you mute yourself, please?
You let your imagination. It's like
Ishita, can you mute yourself, please?
for all the authors, right?
Yeah, you can do it. You can mute.
Okay, I think I'm back. I can unmute myself. Can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me? All right. All right, great. Anyway, so to answer your question, yes, every setting in the collection is very much driven by the character and the main conflict that I was trying to portray for that character.
Thank you, Jenny. How about you, Kiran?
Well, it's interesting because in certain ways, I think I can weave, and even though I'm going to take a very contrarian sort of opinion compared to some of these people, I think in certain ways I can say something to Shivani. And by the way, Shivani, I did read your book. Maybe we can talk about that later. But
Sure. Thank you.
No problem. Regardless, I think that for me, given that I was writing under a very different circumstance, I was choosing to create my topography and the terms of my topography. So when one chooses to do that, one does so at a great risk. I cannot just say a chaiwala and then have an immediate image, suddenly summon in your head. Or I cannot say like a banyan tree and suddenly have an immediate image summon to your head. So what instead I had to do was learn how to create on my terms certain images that could be rendered in this certain book that could then play the same signifier code that we would have in other books, but in the kind of world that this book is in, which is in kind of placeless places. So in such a book, well, we're going to have another question on imagery, so I'll address that part later. But I will say that in such a book, what then becomes kind of the heart of the story is characters and characterization. And I think that is something I put a lot of work into. That is where I really wanted my stories to stand out. Not that my characters were representatives of their places, but they were just fully themselves to such an extent that their place no longer mattered. In fact, that is also one of the arguments of the book, that these people who are parts of the quote unquote forsaken worlds are not just people who are parts of the forsaken world. They're also people who have their own livelihood. They have their siblings. They're people who they care about. And they have their own interior world that are deep and rich as any three-dimensional human being. in order to create these people, I had a book. It was a lovely book that my Somyaka gave me in Frankfurt, Germany. She's my cousin sister, but she lives in Germany. And she gave me this lovely just book with all these pictures of the world on it. And I just started sketching. I said, the shaman, and I just thought the shaman, and I started from the very beginning. Where was the shaman born? How many people were in the shaman's family? How many people did the shaman relate to? What was the person's environment growing up? What was it like to be, this person? Or like the chief sister, or like the prostitute, I would just have these certain images or these certain labels, and I would then slowly conceive the entire world from birth to the point of the story. And then from there, I thought, okay, based on what I conceived of this person, what is their crux? What is their insecurity? What is their story? And then I set it in the environment they were born and brought up in. So for me, I would say that characterization is the space to which my setting kind of comes from, and that my setting is kind of maybe an imprint or an implant of the characters and their worlds and their interior lives.
But each of your characters is set in a different corner of the world.
Or at least 4 different places. And yes,
they're
different in those 4 places. Absolutely, yes. And that's part of it for sure, because I mean, even though I say, so again, I created placeless places. So, they're still part of that. This person might have still been born and brought up in a hovel of the big city, but hovel life, and this is something I'm going to talk about for one of the other kind of parts of the panel, is hovel life is its own life, regardless whether it's in Nairobi or Mumbai or Sao Paulo, there's still certain things that are kind of shared between those people. So I would just think, like, what was it like living in a place, that's just made out of tin, where people are just living in, very rudimentary environments. And I would then try to come from a greater space of understanding from these kinds of just kind of placeless places, if you understand what I mean.
All right, thank you. Imagery is a big part of setting the scene and mood, right? So how do you create imagery in your writing? Sunil, you are an artist, and your travel memoir is the outcome of your illustrations, like you mentioned. So imagery is obviously a visual imagery is a big part of your book. So can you give us a glimpse into your creative process? And before you do that, may I invite you to read a passage from your book?
Let me do that. So I'm going to read a few paragraphs, part of my book where, I'm in Cairo, and probably one of my favorite parts of the book. Let's see if you guys like it. Weaving through waves of humanity, we cross a busy street. The rush hour traffic is snarling, impatience and aggression locked in a vicious cycle. At the head of a tiny street that dips between 2 massive Mamluk-style buildings, John steps aside to make a phone call. And this is where, Ishita, if you could show this, the slides, might be worth to have some imagery to go with it. Something about this location feels very familiar, right? So this is the place where, I'm talking about. Something about this location feels very familiar. Am I getting a flashback from my visit of 2006? Or is this just a glitch in the matrix? Like scratching the general area to pinpoint an elusive itch, I look around searching for clues. The tiny street pinched between the buildings. Pop-up shops selling cheap clothes. A wooden staircase leading to a mosque. Lamps hanging from a wooden lintel. A wooden roof with a skylight. Lamps, wooden lintel, wooden roofs, skylight. The penny finally drops. I know where I am. I'm standing in the middle of a famous Roberts painting titled The Bazaar of the Silk Merchants in Cairo. Next slide, if you don't mind. Right. And so, here you can see, this is the painting on the right is what David Roberts painted in 1839, right? What you see on the left is one of the few photos that I took, Veena. And you can see that the place hasn't changed much at all if you look at it structurally.
Right.
The composition is typical Roberts Fair, monumental architecture framing a colorful local street scene. It captures a typical winter afternoon in North Africa, sunny but cold. Merchants have set up stalls under a wooden roof installed between the two Mamluk structures. The shopkeepers, dressed in traditional winter coats, take a breather as the onslaught of customers has subsided in the hour after lunch. Oriental hand-spun carpets, camel leather shoes, and other wares are on display. Roberts accurately captures the intricate details of the Islamic buildings, the latticed windows, the lamps hanging from the doorway, the massive half-domed niches, the beautiful calligraphy that depicts verses of the Quran. John sees me smile. He wraps up his phone call and says, "I knew you would get a kick out of it." He is beaming from ear to ear. He has set up this moment thoughtfully. He led me to the location and waited patiently, allowing me the delicious sensation of discovery. The Ben El Kesrin is several feet lower than it was in 1839, undoubtedly the result of successive excavations for modern construction. The shopkeepers smoke cigarettes instead of shisha, wear faux leather bomber jackets instead of the long traditional striped robes as they hawk knickknacks in their shops. Otherwise, the street hasn't changed much. Next slide, please. I lean against a wooden post and balance the sketchbook in the nook of my arm. I sketch fast. The Cairean hustle and bustle carefully curves around me as I sketch for the next hour to my heart's content. Occasionally, a passerby slows down to peep at my sketchbook. A question or two is thrown at me, which I field with a smile and a nod of my head. "They think you're Egyptian," John laughs and translates the Arabic questions of the passerby. They're wondering how you have so much time to stand and stare. A passing woman scowls at me and hides her toddler daughter in the folds of her black burqa as if I were pointing a camera at them. An orange seller looks quaint in his jute robe, so I add him to my composition. Halfway through, I look up and he's gone, leaving his oranges behind. I hear a grunt of approval at my right elbow, and there he is watching me sketch. For an incurable introvert like me, these language-less interactions with the locals is a big part of the fun of street sketching. I dip a brush in the humanity around me and apply it to the sketchbook. I capture a cross-section of people's lives, snatch a moment in the fast-flowing river of time, and put it onto the page. Every line is soaked with everyday stories, every stroke, a strand of DNA carrying memories of a society. Thank you.
Wonderful, beautiful.
So what you're seeing here on the screen, sorry, was the sketch that I made as I stood there in an hour and then painted it later when I came back to the studio.
So were all your sketches made in the exact point where David Roberts also made his sketches?
So many of them, my rubric to self when I started was to paint what he painted and missed, right? So there are some places where he obviously was painting at a different point in time. Those were the times when there were no cameras.
Right.
This is
40s.
land that the Western, that's correct, 1840, no cameras, and this is the land that the Western Hemisphere has not really seen. They've only read about it written in the Bible, and so they're eager to see it. So he's sketching almost these massive views to show back to the people of the Western Hemisphere, right? Whereas what I'm doing is mere doodles. They are little notes for self, right? They're irrelevant in the larger scheme of things. So I did pick 8 or 10 compositions, big compositions of his that I really love, and I tried to stand almost exactly where he stood. I spent sometimes many hours trying to line up the line so that I know I was within 10 feet of where I stood.
Amazing, amazing. Shivani, would you like to go next? Imagery is a big part of setting the scene and mood. And how do you create imagery in your writing?
Yeah, as I said in my book, Second House, the house where the protagonists live, is a metaphor for the old India and its inhabitants giving way for the new ones, right? That the old must give way to new people, new ideas is natural. But I wanted to go for a gentler telling. There is a prevalent telling of social change, which is quite brutal. And I wanted, through setting and mood, to make it gentler, more towards some people have lost out, but some people have gained as well. One of the questions I've got in a lot of sessions is, do you feel that the change going on in India is a good thing? And then I say, depends on who you ask, right? So, I went through a lot of different parts of Delhi. And like, you mentioned, I am a lifelong resident of Delhi. And I have a lot of affection for these places. These have been my schools. These have been my picnic spots. These have been where I got married. And I tried to bring out the diversity of Delhi. So, there is a slum, there is a crematorium, there is a club, there is a bar, there is an ashram, there is a wedding. All of these things take place. But I was trying to do it without a sense of bitterness or an otherization, if that makes any sense. I am an intuitive writer, and I try to go with a fly on the wall perspective. So I'm in the room or the place where the story is developing. And that is, very helpful with visualization. Sorry, it's 12:30 a.m. So I'm forgiven all mistakes.
You're great. Yeah. So I had a question about your slum setting, but we'll come to that later.
Sure.
Yes. I'm sorry. Kiran, would you like to go next?
Yes. So I had said earlier that characterization for me is very important. I think another thing that's important is imagery. Earlier we had made a comment about Bhopal, and I just kind of was thinking about research. But in reality, I think that my places, each of the 4 places are imagined or inspired by certain places. Like, say, the place that's destroyed by industrial spill is, to a certain extent, inspired by certain types of places. And then, like the story of Bhopal merging a little bit with the scenery of Odessa in the Ukraine, or Lake Van in Turkey, for example. So it's built to be in certain ways that, I took certain places, environments that I had seen repetitively, like certain, again, big megacities with one slum on one side and a big, like a big mall on the other, like what you'll see in Nairobi or Mumbai or whatever. So there's a certain trope, a certain way that these cities organize themselves. And I wanted to kind of create a setting through those kinds of environments. So imagery was a very important way for me to create a sense of bond to these kinds of placeless places, So for example, in, say, the tribal land, I always make reference to, say, finger trees or red trees or, like thatch houses, these certain things that, again, are not necessarily they're not necessarily part of Indian culture, Amazonian culture, or Papuan culture, but they're set images that repeat and tell you, oh, I'm in this tribe. Or, if I'm in the big city, there's always Galaxy Mall. And, there'll always be, whether you're in a city like Nairobi or whether you're in city Sao Paulo, there'll be some place called something like Galaxy Mall, right? So and that always repeats when you're in the big global city, Galaxy Mall's on the other side, the skyscrapers, So these sorts of images always return with the characters, and they help. So while the novel is discombobulating and going through all these different parts of the world, or these 4 imagined places, I use imagery or repetition of imagery in order to create a sense of you're always returning to this place, even though it's a place you cannot recognize.
Right. Wonderful. Jenny, would you like to go next?
Sure. Yeah. So when it comes to imagery, I think of multiple things. First of all, I think about whose point of view are we in? And what are the things that person would notice? Because that has to be how the camera will pan across the setting. The other thing is what I mentioned earlier was it isn't just about the immediate surroundings. It's also about the historical period, the time of day, sociocultural context. So, if I've got a farmer's wife, there are things that she may notice about her surroundings, the imagery, versus things that somebody visiting from Bombay, the journalist from Bombay, would notice things differently. So for me, it's very much about picking and choosing. It's not just, oh, okay, you know, this is a beautiful scene and what do I want to show? But it's very much about what point of view am I in, and what's the socio-cultural context, what's the historical context, what is the present time of day. One quick example, even when I had a story about an auto rickshaw driver in Bombay, at one point very early in the draft, I had him take a route, which at the time I didn't remember, and I just had him go all the way to Old Bombay in his rickshaw. And then later my brother was reading it and pointed out, he says, whoa, wait a minute. Rickshaws don't go past the Bandra Kurla complex. Only taxis are allowed beyond that. You forgot. And I'm like, oh gosh, yes, I had to change that. And so there are little things like that, which, you know, readers may or may not notice, but I'll know they're there. And that affects how much, you know, so I do a lot of research as far as imagery. I want to make sure I'm getting it right. As I said, again, sociocultural context is important to me. Point of view of the character in the scene, who's noticing, who's doing the, you know, looking, because it's through their eyes that I want the reader to also see and observe. So that's how I approach imagery.
Right. And, you know, your settings are so authentic. We'll come to that later.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Anjali.
Sure. So I will say that early on in my writing, I write settings that are very sort of mechanical. They're there to do a certain job and to illustrate a certain aspect of the story, the character, and where the character will go. And the imagery comes later. Just like I write characters in sort of layers, right? The character initially might be kind of a stock, perhaps stereotypical character. And then I go through the process of breaking it down, really trying to investigate and interrogate what this character's motivations are, how their childhood might have affected the kind of adult they've become. I go through the same sort of evolution with setting and really try to pick apart what that setting's story is, what that setting's life is like. And then that's when sort of the imagery comes to me, because I'm slowly building a relationship between the character and their surroundings. And, you know, I want that relationship to have all of the elements of a relationship between two people. You know, I want them to play off of one another. I want there to be a tension between the setting and the character. I want the setting to sometimes reflect the character's mood, or I want the setting to kind of mock the character's mood, to be so opposite to how the character is feeling and what their psyche is enduring, that you know, that in and of itself becomes a point of the story. So yes, so absolutely, imagery does all of these things. It is such a sort of flexible psychological tool, I think, and absolutely imperative to setting, to any kind of world building.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anjali. Jenny, coming back to you, what stands out in each of your stories is your attention to detail. Each setting, be it in the Midwest or Mumbai or rural Gujarat, especially rural Gujarat, is so rich and vivid. It's like the characters leap out of the pages. Especially in Each of Us Killers, which is the last story, I could visualize the marginalized character sitting around Premji's Kirana and tea shop. So how do you bring so much authenticity to your setting?
Well, I mean,
after you answer your question, you might want to read your passage.
Sure, I will. Thank you. Yeah, you know, as I said, I don't think when I'm writing, oh, how do I make this authentic? For me, what's driving the way that I portray the setting is, as I said, you know, whose point of view are we looking from? And what are the important things? It's almost like, you know, if a camera is panning in a movie scene, you're not just going to do a general pan. You're going to be very strategic in what you dwell on, what you linger on, what are you showing and why. And so I'm very particular about what are the things I am showing and why. To a certain extent, I also adhere to, Chekhov has this rule that, if you're going to put a gun in the first act, make sure it goes off in the third act. That's a very literal thing, and a lot of people don't adhere to that anymore. But what I mean by that is, if I'm going to dwell, if my writer's camera is going to dwell on a certain aspect of the setting, it had better be meaningful. Because again, I was writing short stories. I didn't have the luxury. I'm trying to keep things very compact, right? I'm trying to make sure that everything in a short story is there for a reason. I'm not writing a capacious novel where I have, 3 pages maybe to describe a sunset or whatever. I have to be very strategic. I have 1 paragraph to evoke mood or setting in that particular short story. So with short stories, you have to be very specific. You have to pick and choose very carefully. And that's really what I was aiming for. So with my passage, I'll read very quickly. Actually, it is a rural India setting. It's not the title story, but the reason I'm reading this is the point of view character is a ghost. And the reason for that is when I grew up in India, my mom would tell us folk tales, and there would be ghosts just coming in and out of these folk tales like it's no big deal. And I used to love that in some ways, and in some ways I'd be like, wait, what? And so one of the things I always wanted to do, and I've got at least 2 stories in here that involve ghosts, is that they're just there. They're part of the story. And in this particular one, it's called The Waiting. And I'll just start reading. My last living memory is of my husband carrying my half-conscious body away from the thick heat and clinging wetness of the rice field. Something has bitten my right heel, leaving a crescent of bloody marks. He places me on our cart, jumps on, and prods Saki, our cow, into a jingling trot. Sweat and tears mingle with dust, drawing near black streaks down his cheeks. For 1 whole day after I die, he sits by my body. At night, he lays down beside it. When some street dogs wander in because of the smell and start howling as though in sorrow, the neighbors come. By now, rats have bitten chunks off my toes and fingers, and flies are feasting on what is left. They clear the animals out with kicks and shouts. The tallest man, our village sarpanch, bends over and gives my husband a few short slaps. Your wife is dead. You hear me? You understand? Kumharba is no more. My husband opens his mouth in a soundless response. Nobody asks about what happened. A few of them had seen him bring me home, blood foaming from my gaping lips. News of the dying and dead gets around quicker than anything in our village. They take my stiff, soiled body for the final rites. Him they take to the city hospital. 2 men grab him by his armpits and drag him between them like he's some drunk. The sarpanch waves everyone away as the lines on his face grow sharper and deeper. Like the nearby village leaders, he has, no doubt, bigger concerns. The fear of another drought season, even as water continues to be scarce and the dam repair work goes far too slow. My husband wanders back a day later. Saki had been left tied inside our shed, a small, cool shelter. He brings her out and ties her to the lone limbro tree, putting a bucket of stale water and a pile of chaff within her reach. He squats under the tree in a watchful silence. Thin shoulders curve over his knees, eyes wide and wild like a rabid dog's, an old fragment of yellowed cloth covering his white hair. Though it is time for the monsoons, the sun is as bright as in midsummer. Spheres of scorching light escape from the tree's almost bare branches and fall relentlessly on him. The sarpanch's wife comes by to leave bits of food and a can of water from the daily tanker. She, who had only ever given me dagger looks, begins this daily silent charity toward my husband. He eats without knowing, even trying to chew a piece of tire rubber before spitting it aside. As for the water, he pours half the can into Saki's bucket and barely remembers to drink the rest himself. At dusk, he hangs a flickering kerosene lamp from a tree branch and continues sitting till the shadows get long enough to go inside. And lying on the thin, worn mattress, he does not sleep, as if waiting for morning to start his vigil again. A few days pass like this. From a distance, my husband may seem a wise yogi meditating under that limbro. On closer view, his dimmed eyes and constantly mumbling and dribbling mouth tell a different story. The heat gets worse, though wind rises weekly, once or twice a day, tossing dry leaves, old newspapers, and empty plastic bags around him. All this waiting for what I do not know. To entertain myself, I fly with the birds, beating them to their favorite tree branches. I play with the ants and insects, crawling into their little crevices and homes. I sit on Saki, whose tail swishes rapidly as if 1,000 flies have descended on her. The villagers begin calling him Gaman Kelo, then just Kelo. Kelo means crazy. Schoolboys twirl their fingers near their temples as they spit out the word. He simply looks away. Sometimes he throws stones, clumps of soil, twigs, whatever is in reach, if anyone comes close, not that many do, for he is still wearing those rat-bitten clothes and he reeks like something dug up from a dry riverbed. One boy is more vicious than the rest. He lopes over like some big film villain and lands a kick on my husband's face, sending him sprawling sideways. When the old man stays motionless after falling, the boy runs. His friends following him yell a count in English they must have been learning in school. 1, 2, 3, 8, 9, 10. Some numbers I want them to know. 50, the age of the man they knocked over. 15, my age when I met him as a child bride. 25, the number of years I had been his wife. 50,000, the amount we had gotten for our farmland to pay for my sick parents' hospital bills. 2, the count of bottles of rat poison we had bought to end our constant worries about work and money. 1, the only time I had been pregnant, and he had gone from the happiest to the saddest man I had ever known.
Thank you, Jenny. That was powerful. So Anjali, would you like to go next? You were born and raised in the United States. What kind of research went into the Delhi pre-partition scenes, as well as there are some contemporary Lahore scenes as well? What kind of research went into this?
So the entire process of the novel, research-wise, kind of happened backwards. I had graduated from high school and then college and knew next to nothing about partition. I mean, I knew the bare bones facts, but I'd never sort of been educated about it. Certainly we didn't learn about it in school. So I started after college. I just started reading everything that I could get my hands on. I hadn't the slightest idea of being a writer. I was in my first year of law school. I was spending my weekends trying to escape the Socratic method by hanging out in a very large bookstore in St. Louis, which no longer exists, but it was called Library Limited. And I was reading there until closing time, buying some books, bringing them home. And I did this for years, just checking out books out of the library. It was very late to adopting the internet. So, I was not using it for any kind of research purposes, but I was still finding plenty of books to read. Eventually, I did start using the internet, and I started one of my first searches was partition. I had read numerous books by then and decided to try to find some articles, but what I was really looking for was testimonies from survivors. And I would occasionally find like a video clip on YouTube or on Reddit. I would see a thread of people who were family members of survivors, but there was not a wealth of information that I came across from survivors' specific stories, right? Their narratives about what happened, something more than just like a soundbite until 2011. And that's when I learned about the 1947 Partition Archive, which is a nonprofit organization that was based in the Bay Area initially, and now of course they have research historians stationed all over the world, especially in the subcontinent. And so it wasn't until I discovered that archive, which happened to be in the same year that I returned to Delhi to visit after many, many years. And then that's when the idea of the book started coming together. By this time, I was no longer practicing law, and I was writing a lot of nonfiction. I had written a novel that had nothing to do with partition. And I really had not had any intention about writing about partition until this moment. I mean, there's a vast and diverse array of partition literature. It's not as if the world necessarily needed another book. But the idea of the idea that disturbed me the most, that I found both heartbreaking and interesting about partition, was the fact that close to 70 years passed before there was a comprehensive archive of survivors' stories. Neither at the time, during this time, neither government had taken much of an effort to create an archive. There is now the Partition Museum and other sources, but back then there was very little access to the sort of documentation of what people lived through. And it was only then that I got the idea for the story and that I had more research. But I also was very conscientious of the fact that I had never lived in the subcontinent, had visited, but had never lived. My grandparents had a home there for for generations. My family members had not firsthand experienced partition. They lived in Hyderabad. At the time of partition, they were living in what was known as Madras. And so I, despite 15 years of reading about partition before embarking on the novel, I still was very insecure about making sure that I get the story right. So what I did after I hired 2 authenticity readers who had very sort of long familial histories of partition, I actually hired a researcher. I hired someone who was collecting stories of survivors, who was researching partition, and who was working at the Lakshmi Mittal Center at the South Asian Institute at Harvard. And I was put in touch with her and I hired her, and I asked her very bluntly, can you tell me what couldn't have happened the way that I've unspooled this story? I mean, I want to know. The last thing any author wants to hear is that, their portrayal was not authentic, that the portrayal might have harmed some of the communities that I wrote about. And so in addition to 2 authenticity editors, I hired her, and she picked up, one of the things about reading archives is, these are people's stories based on their memories, and sometimes the information conflicts, right? Sometimes 2 people living at the same time in the same area interpret what was happening very differently. And so hiring sort of someone who had researched the area and could give me some more sort of nuts and bolts about what was happening at that time and how these conflicts could both be true, was extremely helpful to me. And so I spent a lot of that time doing research with the archives. I've not been to Lahore. I would love to have gone to Lahore. Unfortunately, health issues in the past several years have made it more difficult for me to travel. So it wasn't really feasible for me physically to go to Lahore at the time that I was working on later revisions of the draft. I hope someday to go visit though. But I found invaluable these other sorts of tools, this catalog of survivor stories. and being really being able to work with someone whose job it was to research and collect stories and to archive documentation of that time. It was absolutely invaluable to me.
Right. So was any part of your story inspired by what you discovered in the Partition Archive?
There's not a single story in the book that reflects sort of a single person, right? Many of the stories in the book I merge from multiple testimonies, right? I sort of picked and pulled together what I found in order to figure out what the plot would be. So no story is an exact replica. But you know, I do feel that all the characters in some way are an amalgamation of all of the stories I read, right? The truth of many of these testimonies lies in almost every character in the book.
Thank you, Anjali. How about you, Sunil? Your book obviously is based on your travels, but do you have a favorite author or two that you admire for their ability to create vivid scenes? Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I follow, I read a lot of the travel authors. I also read a lot of nonfiction. Most of the books I read have no dialogues. I follow a lot of art. I sometimes spend hours looking at sketchers that I admire and look at their compositions and how they are trying to treat a particular topic or a composition. So a lot of in that sense time I spend in researching the situations that I'm going to be. Very often before I reach a location where I am going to sketch, I have researched it thoroughly. I know the angles, I know what I want to do, how I want to treat it. In most cases, and especially leading up to this book, I had an itinerary that was well planned for me 200 years ahead of time by the author. So I didn't have any leeway there. I didn't have a plot, right? I couldn't have a plot, right? This is, I had to be there. I had to create the plot. And then after I came back, there was very little left to imagination. Whatever had happened, right? So I had to capture it within those three constraints and figure out how to bounce the book between those walls and produce something that was, hopefully something that people would like to read.
You've done a fabulous job. I'm not usually a fan of travel memoirs or illustrated books until I read your book. It was very, very engaging.
Thank you.
Shivani, your story moves from the spacious upper class second house to the squalid slums of Jagdambika camp. So take us into your process of creating these settings.
Specifically to these settings, I have seen all of these settings up close. So not just the posh second house, but the camps which I referred to, and the crematoriums I referred to, all these different places I've seen. So for me to bring authenticity in my writing was not very difficult because I know the places quite well. So like as Anjali was saying about confidence of your subject being important, I didn't sort of lack in that. I had a lot of lack of confidence about writing as a review writer, but the confidence I had in my settings helped, because otherwise I literally have confidence about nothing, right? But, because I think a lot has already been said on the subject, what I've taken away from the other panelists is, write what you know. That's what, and if you don't know, find out. And where I think that, for example, what Jenny said was really important, what she said about the auto rickshaw not going all the way to town and staying in the Bandra Kurla area. It is these small details that give authenticity. And that is where I feel we add as people who have researched or lived or experienced a place fully. I mean, like what Anjali said about partition, right? It is something for which most of us, I'm not from a Punjabi family, but I've grown up in a Punjabi city. It is literally in the air. Like everybody knows somebody who has come back. Everybody actually knows a grandparent or a parent for the older people who have, been victims of partition or on both ends. So either you research it, which Anjali so successfully has, or then you know it. I mean, there's no kind of third way. You have to put in the work or you have to put in the time. I mean, one of the things I'm interested in writing about, which is purely from feeling, is, there was the dreaded second wave of COVID in Delhi in April.
Yes.
I had COVID. My entire family had COVID. I was taking my 85-year-old grandmother who was, delirious with COVID to like different clinics and trying to get her treated. Now, could someone who wasn't here write about COVID in Delhi? Yes. But the setting and the mood and the feeling of being there, the intangibility of that is something which only experience can bring in. Right. So, yeah, I mean, that is what it goes into it, I guess.
So would you consider writing about a setting that you do not know anything about, but may have to research?
So I think that certainly I would, but I would say that I would have to then put in a lot into it and get the details. And this is the first time I've heard of something called an authenticity reader. So thank you, Anjali. That is something I would certainly employ the good offices of, yes.
Right. Thank you, Shivani. Kiran, you're a world traveler. You've lived in 18 different places, speak 12 languages, including my mother tongue, Kannada. So are all your settings based on the places you've lived or visited? And if so, how do you go about trying to understand the culture and the people?
First of all, I think it depends on the project. Like as some of you know, I am working on a giant global novel that takes place all over the world. And that project just requires a much more sense of fastidiousness. And in that world, I'm a little bit between, say, what the Shivani perspective and the Anjali perspective is, and that I at least try to glance it, I try to observe it, I try to take at least 5 seconds of the feeling, but I don't necessarily have the full perspective of someone born and brought up there, and I accept it, I embrace it, and I try to create a work from that perspective. In the context of We of the Forsaken World, which is built on kind of, again, imagined places, the purposeful imagined community of the placeless place, I think that my understanding of setting was drawn very much also on experience of travel. So one of the places that was most important for me was one of some place that you share as well, our lovely ancestral land, Karnataka, and Mysore, which is, so there are 4 characters and 4 spaces in my book. One of them involves a milkmaid that goes house to house, and she has kind of issues with the community because there are rumors of her promiscuity and all that. And in the context of that book, what inspired me was, being a little 5-year-old in Mysore and seeing a milk, not like this type of very voluptuous, sexy one that is my book, but someone that was a milkmaid that would go and give my ajji milk, And I think so that images like that stuck with me. And then I just brought it into another topography. Or conversely, like in order to research tribal lands, I spent about a week in the Manu jungle in Peru. And I just stayed with some missionaries who were like 2 or 3 generations outside of that tribal community, but they were tribal people. They're part of the Machigenga tribe by ethnicity, but they had adopted, but they were still very much like, they were only like maybe 10 kilometers away from tribal people in the sense of like, if I decide to step on the land, they would take a bow and arrow and shoot me dead, you know what I mean? So they were like only 10 kilometers away from that. And they lived in very like rudimentary conditions. I slept in a hammock, I ate papaya and things with them. And it wasn't tribal life, but it was probably something like village life. So, in order to give like a sense of like these sorts of places, I took certain places or spaces that I kind of approached as a traveler, and I tried to use that to kind of merge them into kind of these imagined communities.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kiran. So one thing that connects all our books is that they all address social issues, right? And here I'd like to talk a little bit about my book, Purple Lotus, which you see behind me. So my book was inspired by my early experiences as an immigrant in this country, and they were also inspired by my work as a journalist. Domestic abuse is one of the principal themes of my book. And I see that all the time around here in the South Asian communities, as well as the mainstream communities. And I come from a patriarchal community, and I have seen firsthand what patriarchy can do, not just to interpersonal relationships, but also just the way you view yourself. And so it was very important for me to explore what, these themes, because this is my truth. My protagonist, Tara, is trapped between an abusive marriage and on the one side, and a patriarchal family on the other that, wants her to make peace with her destiny and keep her husband happy. And several victims I know, she has a weak sense of self. She has self-esteem issues. She feels like she has very little control over her life. And so it was very important for me to explore how a woman with a weak sense of self, who already has abandonment fears, how would she find the courage to break free, to gently rebuild her life, and to learn to honor her own worth? My point is, how do you use setting and mood to weave social commentary into your narrative? Shivani, would you like to go first?
Sure. Class and social inequality in Delhi are primary themes in my book. And I would go, as far as saying that the themes in my book, which is a short 55,200-page book, are caste, class, misogyny, patriarchy, domestic abuse, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, and so on. So to write a book of 200 pages with all these themes is daunting, in that I don't blame anyone who, when told this, says, oh, maybe I'll read this one a little later, it's very heavy. So I had to bring a certain lightness from the mood and the setting, because, if I took an analogy, I'm going for a wedding, I wear a heavy sari, then I put on some heavy jewelry, then I say, oh, let me wear, some red lipstick and some red nail polish and so on. I'm going to look like a caricature, right? So you have to play down something. So I wanted to keep the mood and setting light. So I worked on that. Sikand House, like I said, is the metaphor for India as it is. And, without going into the entire book, the staff quarter where the little boy, who's the driver's son, lives, and the main house where the protagonists live. One space, opulent, chandeliers, fancy furniture, whatever, and the other, tube lights, simple, functional. And that is to tell us the place of those characters in the world, in that the staff quarters, for example, are built to be invisibilized. They are functional like the people who live in them, that your purpose is to serve, and you can live with the minimum, and beyond that, we don't want to see you. Traditionally in India, all staff quarters are in a concealed part of the larger bungalows. So, I think that these themes are very well explored through a space, because what says more about us than the spaces we inhabit, right?
Right. And I'd like to invite you to read a passage from your book. So, and if you want to continue the conversation, you can.
Sure. No, I think that a reading is a good idea at this point, and I will keep it short. And, I'm just going to start at the beginning, because that does give you an idea of mood. This is set in June 2016. The last of the bags packed, Parul and Ahan Sikand were ready to leave their family home for the final time. Acquired in 1946, Sikand House was intended to be the cradle for many grandsons and great-grandsons in the coming years. Displaced as he was at Partition, Rai Bahadur Manohar Krishna Sikand, Ahan's grandfather, a largely self-made man with a premonition about difficult times ahead, didn't suffer the life of a refugee, having swapped his house with that of an equally astute Muslim acquaintance before all the madness began. It was a gentleman's agreement. The Rai Bahadur arrived in Delhi by air, with gold coins sewn into the lining of his and his wife's coats. Their worthy possessions had followed by road, including the heavy teak furniture and cast iron cooking utensils that had been part of his wife's dowry. As the family prospered in a new country, still finding its feet, they hosted the leading industrialists of the time and sheltered many a young, worse-off cousin in Delhi to take an exam or for a job interview. Sikand's house lawns had seen Baithaks and performances. A young Farida Khanum had sung at Ahan's parents' wedding, which Indira Gandhi herself had attended at the height of both women's careers in the late 1960s. There would be no place for this largesse in Ahan's future. A builder was to swiftly and efficiently raze Sikand house to the ground and replace it with a block of carelessly constructed flat, where multiple families would take a piece of the Rai Bahadur's dream and plant their own in its place. The June sun was unforgiving, with temperatures so high that even the mosquitoes couldn't survive. In better days, Ahan and Parul would have been holidaying in London around this time, drinking artisanal gin and tonics every evening at the South Audley pub with their friends from school or parents of their children's friends, Delhi Walas with apartments in London. Ahan walked out for the last time, abstractedly rearranging his thinning hair. Terrazzo would give way to Botticino, and the driveway where he had learned to ride a bike was to be a stilt area in the new construction, where vacant-eyed servants would inhabit tiny airless porter cabins on the border of legality, inhaling the diesel-lead-filled air that the generator would regularly spew into their rooms. The builder got permission from the municipal corporation to cut down the old samel tree which his grandmother, his dadi, had planted when she had moved there, the one in which hundreds of birds lived and sang at dawn and dusk. He vividly remembered playing with its cotton and pretending it was snow. Where it once stood would now be a parking spot, a precious and hotly contested piece of real estate in the new order of things. He would be returning here after it was rebuilt to live in a flat, a 3-bedroom hall kitchen unit, 1 bedroom for him and Parul, 1 for their children, and 1 for his mother, separated from his own, with the thin 4.5-inch brick walls that the builders use now. So I'll stop here. This is the book. I wasn't organized enough earlier to hold it up. So, here what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to show you many things within the image. The loss of the house, of course. The fact that the partition story of the Sikands is very different from the other kind of stories we hear of loss, in that they came well advanced, they were prepared. And these things happened as well. And then the contrast of the new house, which is New India and the New Delhi. So a lot of it packed into that paragraph.
Thank you, Shivani. Anybody else wants to jump in and answer this question? My question was, how do you use setting and move to weave social commentary into your narrative?
Yeah, I'll just add, I think with my collection, I didn't intentionally set out to say, okay, I'm going to weave social commentary, because to me, the story is what it is. There is, given that it's India, you're going to have caste, gender, class, all the issues that Shivani mentioned, which, obviously are very much prevalent in the workplace, whether it's in India or in the West. And so I don't think you intentionally set out to say, oh, I am going to put these ingredients into this story. But if you want your story to have the depth and the layers that it needs to have to truly engage the reader, you're going to have those elements in your story and as part of your setting. I don't see how you can get around it. And as I said, again, the setting has to be such that it is very, interwoven with your story. You can't take that story and place it somewhere else and have the same effect. And so therefore, whatever the sociocultural context is for your protagonist, for the characters in a particular scene, they will come out if you've done your job, if you've done your research, and if you've, written the scene the way it needs to be written. So I don't think we consciously say, oh, I'm going to have this setting speak to a social issue as such. It just has to be part of the fabric.
And your collection packs in a lot: suicide, misogyny, sexual assault, hate crimes, Dalit issues, right? Yeah, thank you, Jenny. Anybody else?
I think I have an interesting argument or sort of thought that I can pose to this question. I think for me, We of the Forsaken World was an argument that I think is also very easily arguable, but for the sake of the book, I wanted to create like 4 topographies, like the global city, the small city or the big town, the village, and then the tribal. These are like probably 4 types of humans that I think one could argue you can see in all sorts of nations or peoples. And I wanted to take these sorts of places, these sorts of topographies, and I want to locate them in places that I think beyond these 4 types of humanities are also outside of the areas of discussion, that when we talk about global problems, when we talk about the humans that are kind of outside of the scope of global discourse, I want to bring them in the forefront of a novel or of a social narrative. And so I think my book in several ways is trying to argue for that new topography, or trying to argue for the space where we're not observing humans and we're not just kind of classifying them as, say, Indian or Turkish or Botswanan or whatever, but we're starting to look at them for maybe other certain intangible traits that, I do think there is the big city mentality that you can find a Mumbaiker or a New Yorker or a Londoner, or like a tribal person, who has such a closed and certain, again, if they see anyone who's outside that tribe, they'll immediately take their bow and arrow and shoot you, whether it's outside the Andaman Islands or in the Amazon, right? So I wanted to kind of argue for these sorts of humans, and also say that they're not just humans that are arguably existences, but that should, particularly in regards to tribals or these kind of unspoken villages, that they deserve to be more talked about in global discourse or the narrative of globalization.
So thank you, Kiran. So would you like to read a passage at this point?
Yeah, sure. And I think this is a good time for it, especially since we're running a little, we only have 20 minutes left, so we should probably start getting to that. I am going to read one of the characters that is from the tribe, because I think one thing that's very important for me also as an artist is the space of indigenous discourse, and how I think a lot of the First Nations and the people who are part of the First Nations can kind of offer us a new pathway to look at the globe or global discourse and resuscitate our understandings of it in the 21st century. And so this is one of the characters who's a warrior, and he's suddenly witnessing the decline of the space, and I'll explain it through his words. The strange bends of their blades, the texture of their skin, these are the things I know, but there's much I do not know. They do little to scare me, yet I feel as I have no control. The finger trees were far in the distance. The midday sun used them like its eyelid, with the vines around them flittering in its eyelashes. The red tree's mark was a scratch. It was not the scratch of human nails, nor was it a scratch of the great cat's paw. It was a deep indent the shape of a crescent moon, thin but wide enough to have eaten half of the red tree's width. Such are the mysteries of the jungle. Perhaps where the touched man is, they control the great cats and ride them to their huts. They might have adapted the bark of their arms to allow them to hop between the branches. Or they might have put their metal arrows so deep in the minds of the monkeys and turtles that the animals no longer walk. These are the things I don't know. During these moons, I have seen that they have many ways to hurt the trees. There's a path of pointed bush between the vines. The stubs of their roots were left, but not the bodies. I sniffed a foreign smell, but I couldn't make out what it was. It wasn't papaya or sapota, nuts or turtle, fish or great cat, monkey, any kind of flesh. If I even tried to breathe, it made me cough. Do they there possess animals of fruit that emits scents I dare not imagine? I took the path away from the stump, taking care not to hit my head on a nearby wasp nest and slapping my palm against my mouth. These wasps were sensitive to noise. A family of monkeys sat on the roof on the other side of the nest. One of the children was walking up to its mother with its rear up. The mother monkeys hissed at me through their teeth. I hooted and made passage. They did not bite. I leaned against one of the finger trees where there was a bush of red berries and picked some to store in my satchel. Do you remember the first time we ate these together? And then it goes into a little bit of his relationship with his one of his women who happens to be the shaman. I'll just skip that part. I found a red tree and ran my finger along it. I walked until the sun closed its eyes, the clouds curling over it. The sky was magenta, the sky was mauve, the sky was black. I crossed the river to the side of our conquerors, to the side of my home. The orange water was darkened by the moss and tree branches and mud. The waves gurgled and guzzled and gulped. There were corpses in the place of the mangroves, gutted of their intestines by the arrows. I waded into the water and began to swim. The clouds combined with the smoke from burning trees to flow billowing shapes in the sky. Had the thatched men already arrived? I climbed up the silt. Outside the first tent, one of the warriors who had found the first of these thatched men stood around scratching himself. His skin was covered in red bumps, and there were patches of exposed muscles visible on his arms and legs. And so this is... This also goes on for a little bit, so I'll move on to another section. And basically what happens is, these tribal people have been exposed to, thatched men is just a code word for people who wear dress. Finger tree is like a certain type of tree that is kind of white and very thin. So basically I'm trying to represent, and also the idea of silver arrows, which are actually bullets. So these are like ways that tribal communities who have not learned what a gun is, or learned what a bullet, or learned what clothing is, would kind of describe it in their own language. It goes to here. I took out one of my satchels, one of the few flowers she liked. It was red, dirty around the stem, with small blue corollas arched into the arm, arched into the air in the form of a kiss. People around you take you for granted, but you're everything to me. You are a leader, a fighter. You are a person who deserves love. You're the thoughts I can never articulate. You're the reason why I believe in myself. You're the person who gives me faith and inspires me to live my life vividly. I can't imagine opening to someone else who I can open up the way I do to you. You're the only person in the world who is special to me. I sucked on my saliva. Our eyes met. This is him describing his woman. As long as you keep your hand in mine, I can stare into the eyes of a great cat and never feel my heart shudder. With you near me, I can walk in the depths of this river and find my mouth full of breath. I can reach up and touch the sun and never feel as much warmth as I do when my hand is around yours. I don't know if I'll ever be able to say it out loud. My palm grips her tightly. The flower crushes between our palms. The clouds do little to hide the tint of moonlight. The river rushes and roars as it is sound the dragonflies buzzing about. Plants the size of my leg hung against the mud cliff. I showed how we must swim. Then we swam. The moon brimmed with the light of all the spirits. We reached to the other side of the forest. This is the land where the end of days was meant to begin.
Thank you, Kiran. That was lovely. I think we have just 15 minutes, or less than 15 minutes, 12 minutes left into our session. So let me take some of the questions. So there's a question here from Lee Anderson for each of us, a few panelists. How do you avoid cliches when creating setting? Anyone? Jenny or Sunil, do you want to take that?
Get a good editor.
Good.
Yeah. I think what I say to my students is always, again, what I've said before is, to avoid giving the reader the usual, what they're expecting. Try to find something different that that is still realistic, but try to look closer, look differently at a scene. It's very much as I imagine Sunil when he's doing this artwork, which is what David Roberts had done. But of course, Sunil, you're going to try to find something within that scene that is your own vision or your own insight. And that's the thing that I always say to my students is, you've got to connect with it. This scene has been there for centuries. I'm writing historical fiction right now, and it's set in medieval Gujarat. I didn't live in medieval Gujarat, but I have to, my protagonist is one of in one scene, she's only 9 years old, and I have to make sure I'm understanding how would a medieval child at the age of 9, how would she experience her world? And so to some extent, I call it, just like you have method acting, I say it's method writing. You've really got to get yourself into that frame of mind and get into that scene. So yeah, method writing works for me anyways. So.
Right.
Can I also jump in on this question? Because I want to be totally transparent here and say, there is like nothing that bothers me more than a writer in the diaspora who sticks the Taj Mahal in their novel. And that's what I did. I actually did that. But I had a very specific reason for that, which is I found it to be the ideal setting to contrast what was a very fractured father-daughter relationship. Here's this father who's very clumsily trying to emotionally connect with his 10-year-old daughter. who he's missed half of her life now, he still sees her as this 5-year-old, right? Who's just recently stopped wetting the bed and who probably sucked her thumb for a long time, when really she's transforming into this sort of a little bit of an unruly preteen, developing some sarcasm maybe and trying to kind of blow him off. But the Taj Mahal ended up being the best place to have this scene. Here he is dragging to this renowned tourist destination in an attempt to repair their relationship. And it speaks very much to the sort of timeliness of the place and the enduring relationships of the emperor and his deceased wife. And she's really still punching holes through this vision he has of their relationship. So certainly, I didn't want to be one of those writers that just was like, oh, here's something that everybody knows about in India. But it ended up being the best place for them to sort of fumble through this really awkward relationship where the 10-year-old girl feels very betrayed by her father and sort of, shows how betrayed she feels in light of this other much better relationship that her own parents never had, and that foreshadows the fact that Sean doesn't have this kind of romantic relationship in her future either. But it is absolutely something that I thought about, and I wanted to make sure that it didn't fall into those tropes, because there just are so many with this particular setting.
Right. So there's a comment here. It's not a question, a comment from Jyotsna, who's my colleague. And this is for Kiran, Anjali, and Jenny Bhat. Having read each of your authors' works, I can honestly say that each of them were uniquely different, but had the ability to draw the reader in immediately. So that's Jyotsna's comment. Moving on to the next question. This is from Monica. How do you get comfortable writing about settings you have never visited, lived in, or different time periods, keeping things authentic? The easy answer is research, but any other tips, guidance, or thoughts?
I might have some interesting thoughts to share on that. And I'm saying that as someone who's, again, working on a book right now that is set in 365 different places in the world. And some of them, I usually try to pick places that I have actually visited, but there's once in a while I want to attempt to write a story, like maybe about going to a jazz bar in Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire, for example, which I've not had the experience of doing yet. In which case, first of all, just the fact that I'm an Indian American writing about a jazz bar in Côte d'Ivoire, I'm probably not going to write anything too authentic. I'm not someone who necessarily attempts to write authentically. I'm trying to rather if I'm writing authentic, I'm writing authentically to myself and what I want to create in that particular moment. So my idea of authenticity might not be one of learning about a different culture, trying to understand that, but connecting to another person using my writing and being authentic to that connection. So I might just try to avoid thinking, am I being authentic or not? Because probably I'm not going to be authentic and I should just accept that and move on. I think there are other interesting, however, that being said, I should not be wildly irresponsible either. I should do research, as Veena said. I do research. I would, Google a lot. I would go on YouTube. One thing that's wonderful about YouTube now is there's so many beautiful videos of almost all major global cities or spaces where you can literally type in Abidjan footwalk or something, or Mumbai footwalk, and they just take you through parts of Bandra, the Haji Ali Mosque, and it's like it's not really like you're fully there, but it's at least better than having nothing. I really like watching these videos, because they kind of help me kind of orient myself. I also, of course, go to Google Maps, because Google Maps now has that ability to kind of, you literally can drop yourself into different places and then like sort of wander like through that little yellow figure. And of course, then reading different articles, depends on what I'm trying to create, however, but I would say that most possibly the story is not authentic, but I do my best to try to create an illusion of authenticity also by making it about the characters, about making it through that very specific moment that my characters are dealing with, and how that can sometimes distract, but make it more about the interrelation, which might be outside of just the specifics of that culture and can be understood regardless of those specifics.
Thank you, Kiran. So the next question is from Alka, our program director. And this question is for all the authors. What's the one aspect of your setting that becomes the linchpin of your story? No?
Well, I mean, I think
So-
I think the answer is different for different stories, right? I mean, and for different scenes. I don't know that there is a set single answer to that question. But, you know, I'll just give examples of two other writers rather than my own work. When you think about Rohington Mystery, okay, well-known writer, most of his writing, most of his setting is Bombay. But he wrote about a Bombay of the 70s or of an earlier time that doesn't exist today. And so one of the things that, you know, it's not historical, it's near historical, you could say. But when you think about the Bombay that he created, you're there, you can feel it because he gives you everything. He's not just giving you the 5 senses, he's giving you the 8 senses. And I say 8 because I talk about the sense of place, sense of mystery, sense of the unknown. And there is just a lot more going on, right? And so I think, to me, when you say linchpin, it's hard to say linchpin, but I would say what makes the place truly memorable is if you've got enough immersion details that the reader feels they are right there in the thick of it, as you do with Rohington Mysteries Bombay. It's not a Bombay that exists today, but you're taken back. I think of Kiran Desai's Inheritance of Loss, the house, Choyu, which is where the judge lives. The house is a character in its own. So Rohington Mystery uses a frame, setting as a frame, and Kiran Desai has used the house, Choyu, as a character of itself in the story. It's a living, breathing character. As the seasons change, things happen in the house. In a way, it mirrors the main protagonist, the judge, but still it's its own character. So again, that's how you immerse the reader. You're bringing in the details and the living breathingness of the setting. And I think that, to me, is what's most important. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. Here's another question from Ishita, and this is for all the authors. Is it easier to write about a familiar setting, or would you prefer to write through your imagination?
I mean, obviously, I would imagine that a familiar setting is much easier because, you know, well, maybe I'm a little lazy, but it's a lot less work, right? You already know everything about it. And the confidence which, you know, Anjali was talking, that she had to work very hard and read a lot about partition, which anyone would, because we didn't live at that time. It's already there, right? So certainly I would say it's easier. Maybe I'm just being lazy at this late hour, but it's definitely easier, yeah.
Right. Has anybody attempted magic realism here? That's, you know, that has to come from your imagination, I would imagine. So the next question is from Jyotsna, once again, my colleague. What are the challenges of bringing fiction into reality-based events? The partition or the Kuchibotla incident?
I'll let Anjali answer first.
Yes.
So what I'm a little confused as to the question. What are the challenges
of creating fiction that's inspired by real life events? I think that's what she means.
You know, for me, it's all about sort of finding the story that feels like something that I'm capable of telling, right? You know, when I was doing a lot of research of partition, of course, there were numerous stories that can be told about it. But ultimately, I have to find the story from which I feel like I can connect with the sort of the emotional reserves of the story. I'll give one example. I mentioned earlier that that my own family members are not survivors of partition. However, I'm half Indian and a quarter Puerto Rican, but our Puerto Rican family endured a tragedy that resulted in my complete disconnection from my Puerto Rican heritage. So I knew my Puerto Rican grandfather. He passed away when I was 6 years old. And at the time he passed away, he was completely estranged from his own family. So when I was looking at things like researching this historical event and reading people's testimonies, what I was moved by the most were stories of descendants whose relatives had passed away before they knew what their stories were, right? They knew that they had relatives who lived through partition, who had stories, but those relatives were never able to talk about what they lived through. And that ended up being my doorway, right? Of me feeling like I do not have any connection to Puerto Rican culture, my Puerto Rican heritage. I knew my grandfather. He passed away when I was 6. I do not really have any sort of memory that is my own of him and what it was like. I've got some photos of him. I know where his death certificate is, but I really just have no connection with that side of me. And that's what resonated with me in the research, were interviews with people who lost this entire connection to their ancestral history. And that's where the sort of research merged with my own personal narrative in a way that I could sort of get my head around the material and enter that material.
Well, thank you, Anjali. And I think we're running out of time. So it's a wrap. On behalf of Tasveer and our panelists, I thank you all for joining us. Do check out our panelists' books. They are available everywhere books are sold. And we have a wonderful lineup of author conversations through this month. Do check out the schedule and register at tasveerfestival.org. And on behalf, yes, that's it. Thank you so much for joining us and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Good night. Thank you.